Good morning. My name's Brent. This is actually my first time doing an artist talk so publicly, so just excuse my initial nerves. I've come through Monash University, completed my master's degree in 2012, and following that I was fortunate to score a position there, so I work there now as a technical officer. And I suppose this work, it came from sort of the end of my master's sort of experience, and I've spent quite a lot of time with it over the last couple of years, and only really sort of reached its resolve, early this year. So it's actually quite a nice thing to see it in completion. So it's called Affectation, and I basically like to title my works with sort of single-worded sort of entry points, I suppose I'd like to think of them as a way of sort of approaching the work. So the symbology of it sort of comes from my high school days, where my work began as sort of self-portraiture. And then coming into Monash University, I had this opportunity to work with this really interesting, exciting material. And coming from a two-dimensional background into the world of glass was quite an exciting experience, and something that I'm still very passionate about, and now get the wonderful opportunity to share that with people coming into the workshop at Monash. So as a way of getting into my work, I was actually sort of under the guidance of George Islanis, who was one of the lecturers at Monash University. His work's upstairs, so you may have seen that. And he was quite a good mentor, and sort of put me down the path to where I am now. And so translating the very, very literal references of myself in these self-portraits that I kind of was producing in my early years, and then finding a way to talk a little bit more generally about sort of multifacetedness and identities. And I suppose the imagery came out of masks and different cultures and art movements and those things. So there's a lot of visual inspirations that kind of inform them, but they begin as drawings. So I spend a session where I draw 30, 40, 50 images and come back to them later on and try and translate these two-dimensional linear drawings into a three-dimensional object. And that's quite a difficult thing sometimes, because you start with initial concept and you'll go through a number of changes, actually realising it in the real. So this one, as I said, I've actually spent a couple of years, and it's gone through sort of major modifications. Beginning initially as a clay, and I sculpt this against a hard board, so in the open mould technique, and that gives you a window side into the work, because that's exposed to the kiln as it's going through its firing process. And I do enjoy sort of manipulating that and sort of using that to inform the work, because one of the interesting things about glass is, as a sculptural medium, is it reveals its interior and really allows you to experience the surface and the interior sort of space. And I call them habitable spaces, because I create faces, identities, masks, and I like how you can sort of piece together the different elements in the work to produce a number of faces and things. So having this internal space, to me, is almost like a bodily cavity for a soul. So having this sort of illuminated inside is actually very, very important to the work. And I like how it's positioned here, because quite often it's easy to champion the glossy surface, which really is one of those alluring aspects of glass. So this side, I tried to sort of create a number of windows, facets that would actually allow you to sort of really read into some of these chance happenings that are occurring within the work. A question I sort of get a lot when I talk about my work publicly is, what do you think about the bubbles, all these happenings inside the glass? And to me, that's part of the process itself, allowing the glass to sort of go through these changes, and it begins a dialogue that will then sort of inform where the work goes from start to finish. So in this work, there's a couple of bubble patterns and things that have occurred, which are initially quite frustrating, having these strange patterns that are going on, because ideally you want a work free of imperfection, but in some ways having these anomalies inside the work actually speak volumes about ourselves and our personalities and those sorts of things. So walking around the work, you will kind of get some views into that. So I suppose my work, it was initially about sort of discovering myself, and it still is. I suppose that'll be something that will inform my work practice for many years. So this work is exploring this relationship between how we're read as individuals and how we engage with people and different faces we bring to different environments, how our initial sort of meetings with people and the revelations we give to people in our conversations are not always sort of married up to who we are as individuals. So initially sort of looking at the work at a glance won't really give you the insight unless you come up and actually experience the work sort of firsthand. And I think that is something that sort of speaks in volumes to me. So I do like to experiment with textures, shapes and patterns to sort of give it some interest. The colours sort of come about when I've actually begun to create the work, so I don't actually start out with a particular colour in mind, but as I'm spending time with the initial sculpt, I'll sort of then start sort of having a discussion with it and seeing where that goes. And my glass comes from sort of rural Victoria, so it's a handmade glass, and you kind of do get some variance within the work, which sort of some of those happenings that we talked about before. So I do like to mix them up as best I can. So I suppose this work's got a number of different faces if you look at it. It's been called a totem and a few other things like that, but the real sort of idea behind having the different noses and faces within it is to talk about this internal dialogue that a lot of us have in different environments, and I think that's getting close to talking about most of this, so if you've got any questions.
Brent, what about the choice of blue?
So I find blue quite an emotive colour, and I kind of like to work with quite a cool palette, so I normally am working with blues and things. I suppose it's an emotive colour for me, so making these works is kind of quite a good emotional release. So blue to me is probably, I wouldn't call it a sad colour, but I'd say it sort of is reflective of my feelings at the time. So this was coming to at the end of a very, very stressful time in my life, so producing something blue and big and was kind of just a fun way of ending what was a pretty intense journey through the master's process. Yeah.
And you said it's transformed over a couple of years. What did you do to it? What did it look like before?
Well, initially the concept was having it as a paired object, and the space that existed between them was going to talk sort of much more directly about a relationship. But that one I lost to the kiln gods during the firing. So I then had this work that didn't quite fit. So his hood was probably up about here, and this cape, I suppose, was much larger. So I've actually cut and changed it a couple of times, and I've sort of had that sitting in my office and engaging with it, drawing on it, scribbling on it, cutting bits out. So I actually added on these second facial details, and I took quite a lot of his chin off. I didn't like how his lips were because they were a bit too much of a pout and things like that. So, and changed the hair. I mean, I kind of, it's kind of an in-joke really, but it kind of reminds me a lot of my best friend, because he's got quite a big nose and spiky hair. So he doesn't like me saying that, of course, but I look at that and it kind of reminds me of of him a lot, so kind of ended up going towards that. And a lot of these sort of polished elements it's not something I normally do in my work. Normally I've got the high polished reverse side of the work. But because of all these sort of strange patterns and things that were occurring, I also could make it actually much more interesting and relevant to reveal those a little bit more. And that sort of engages with light and the sort of interior of it quite a lot. So, so those changes happened.
Well, it might have taken a couple of years to finish because it looks like there's a lot of hand grinding there. It looks like there's a lot of angles that just can't be done by machine. Is there a lot of hand grinding?
Well, there's a little bit. Like I don't typically do a lot of hand finishing, but we've got a flexi drive wet grinding head called a Sooner. So I use that. So it's quite a lot of hours spent bringing all these surfaces up. But all these other details are put on with basically a dental micromotor and engraving bit. So that probably took the longest time. And sort of cutting these larger bits off and then bringing those to sort of refinement was quite a process. But I mean, I do enjoy leaving the bit of evidence of process throughout the way in it. So even having some of those tooling marks on there, I'm okay with. Like I know part of my training was to sort of produce what as most perfect object you could, but I kind of like an object that has some evidence of process and the maker left in it.
And do you look at it now and see it as done, or do you think, maybe if you need to tuck over here?
Well, it's a difficult one because you've spent all this time having such an intimate relationship with it. I'm quite happy to be done with it. I don't actually need to. I don't need to see it again. I don't need to spend any more time with it. But I mean, I suppose it's one of those things. Where do you stop? And I suppose having a deadline to get it up here was a good. Get it finished and resolved. So yeah, I do probably think it's done. Yeah.
Right. You have no thoughts of resurrecting another half of it, or?
Well, I did for a while, but as it became a standalone object, I kind of really brought it into that side of things, and that. No, I'm quite happy with that, and I think if something was to evolve from this, it would start from scratch again. So I'd take it back to a clay and bring that up. But I don't often like to repeat very, very similar forms. So this will probably be it for this one, and moving on to the next thing.